Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve, the lone pleasurologist. Thanks for stopping by. Welcome to a meeting of the Pleasurology Overachievers Club, or the Pleasurology Would-Be Overachievers Club, also known as the pioneers of pleasurology, those of us who are interested in learning how to take the pleasure-generating apparatus of our organism, our body, our nervous system, our brain, our consciousness, and learn how to create as much pleasure as possible with our pleasure-generating apparatus. And so, to that end, I'm telling you about my own personal sexual history, because each of us needs to come to terms with our own personal sexual history, understand the influences that have shaped our present-day sexuality, so that if there are influences that have had a negative effect on our own ability, for instance, to become sexually aroused and to have orgasms, and to do this without guilt or anxiety, we need to be able to understand what those influences, those negative influences were on our sexual development, and we need to look at them and say, okay, those are not valid inputs. If they are trying to make me feel that my sexuality is somehow impure and bad and wrong, even though I am very careful to make sure that when I satisfy my sex drive, I am not seriously annoying or harming or hurting anyone else. And if we do that with solo sex, then it's quite clear that we can have solo sex without annoying anybody else. And when we have partner sex, we have to be very responsible about not transmitting STDs or getting accidentally pregnant or breaking somebody's heart. But otherwise, if both partners are completely willing and completely enjoying the situation and are both sexually healthy in terms of sexual microbes, then our sexual activity, whether it's solo sex or partner sex, is creating pleasure and joy in our consciousness, and it is performing an important psychological function, that is satisfying our sex drive. Our sex drive is built into our brain, it's built into our emotional brain, and if we don't satisfy our sex drive, we're not thoroughly happy in life. We need to satisfy our sex drive every so often in order to be fully happy. Of course, some people will suppress their sex drive completely and never satisfy it, but usually they're not completely happy either. They're not fully happy individuals. And so they don't, well, like nuns, for instance. You know, it's legendary how mean nuns can be as teachers. You know, it's partly because they're not supposed to ever satisfy their sex drive. And our sex drive is something that is 600 million years old and is deeply built into our brains and our bodies. It's one of our two strongest drives. You know, our food drive and our sex drive. And then, of course, in general, surviving, that is running away from danger, escaping danger. But in a positive sense, we need to satisfy our sex drive in order to have a naturally happy, full human life, which, as we know, was the attitude of the Polynesians towards sexuality. They simply saw sexual activity as one of the great things in life. And they didn't believe that any of their gods were worrying about the sex lives that human beings were having with each other. The gods weren't concerned with that. They were concerned with other stuff. And so the Polynesians did not have the concept of any kind of sexual activity as a sin, in the sense of something that would offend one of the gods. But we've grown up in a culture that has for 2,000 years believed that most forms of sexual activity are displeasing to God. Now, God is just an imaginary concept. It is an imaginary concept that we project onto that which is absolutely unknowable. That is, God is supposed to be some non-physical being that's in control of everything. Well, that could be. We don't have any way to test that statement because it's impossible for us to observe any non-physical beings. So there could be any kind of non-physical beings out there. There could be no non-physical beings out there whatsoever. We just don't know. And so what we know about that which is absolutely unknowable is absolutely nothing. And we should never claim to know anything about how any imaginary non-physical beings look on human sexuality. However, we've all been taught, if we've grown up in a Christian culture, we've been taught that there is a God out there who doesn't like us being sexual. And that's a false truth claim that Christians make about the unknowable, the absolutely unknowable. They falsely claim that the absolutely unknowable is upset when we give ourselves sexual pleasure. We have no reason for believing that whatsoever because we know nothing about any absolutely unknowable imaginary non-physical beings. So it's important for us to recognize that all versions of God are just human imaginings. But human beings can equally well imagine God as being completely sex positive and having the attitude, the only thing I care about is that the beings that I have created are as happy as possible. I created them so that they could be as happy as possible. What other reason would I have for creating these beings? You know, if God can create the universe, he doesn't need some little human beings running around on planet Earth praising God to tell God how great God is, because God's been able to create a universe with 400 billion galaxies, which means at least 400 billion inhabitable planets, life-supporting planets, you know. So I don't think that if there was a being that created this universe, that it did so in order to have us praise it and tell it how great it is. It already is great. It doesn't need reassuring about that. I'm sure God does not have a problem with self-esteem if God exists and has created the universe. I think, you know. So why else would God create creatures except for us to enjoy ourselves, to enjoy our consciousness? And so in order to counteract the sex-negative image of God that was taught to us erroneously by Christian people who brought us up, we counteract that imaginary image of God with our own imaginary image of God, which is a more rational imaginary image of God, that God actually wants us to have as much pleasure as we possibly can, and to give each other as much pleasure as we possibly can, as long as we do it intelligently and cautiously, so that we don't have any bad delayed after effects. But other than that, we should imagine that indeed, if there is a God, God wants us to be as happy as possible and to create and generate as much pleasure in our consciousness in every way as possible, including not just sex, but also psychedelics, if we enjoy psychedelics. That God would be saying, yes, I'm glad that you can enjoy psychedelics because that helps you enjoy how beautiful this world is that I've given you. If God created this world, it is a beautiful world, it is a lovely world, and the psychedelics help us appreciate how lovely the world is and make us more grateful to the universe that we happen to live on such a beautiful planet. You know, the psychedelics make people more religious, not less religious, but they make people religious in a very positive way, in that when you're high on a psychedelic, you can imagine a very benevolent creator being who has created such a beautiful planet and has given us the capacity to have so much pleasure and enjoyment in life, who has given us the ability to love each other and hold each other, give each other hugs and nurturing affection. Because nurturing affection is every much a need, a deep need of ours, as is sexuality and food. Actually, what does an infant need when an infant is born? It needs nurturing affection. Sure, it needs food, needs protection. It doesn't need sex yet, usually. Although, as we saw in Polynesia, parents will masturbate their children. If the child is fretful and unhappy, the parent will masturbate the child until the child calms down and goes to sleep. The parent is teaching the child in that instance that pleasure from the child's sex organs is associated with affection and nurturing and being taken care of. And so that forms a positive emotional connection between sexual activity, that is, feelings of pleasure from the sex organs, that the memory of that pleasure is emotionally connected with being held, nurtured, being made to feel safe and loved. And we all need that. And that's one of the things that we don't get as we grow up, is nurturing affection, physical nurturing affection from each other, which we could give each other, because there are so many of us, it would be easy for us to give each other hugs all the time, including sandwich hugs with one person in the middle and two people on the outside. One of the great experiences of life doesn't cost a penny. All you need is two willing friends to join you with it, and everybody gets a turn in the middle. And that's one of the great experiences of life, as long as it's an experience that you want to have. We shouldn't coerce people into having a sandwich hug if they don't want to have a sandwich hug, if they're not ready for it yet. That would be sandwich hug rape. If we coerced someone into having a sandwich hug that they didn't want, we should never try to coerce people into any pleasurable experience that they don't want. We can encourage them to have it and say, you really should try this, because a sandwich hug is wonderful. If you just relax into it, don't be afraid of it. Just let go. Let yourself be engulfed in human love and affection. Let yourself have this experience. But we're not going to force it on you. If you don't want it, that's okay, Same thing with a massage. Either a clothes-on massage or a clothes-off massage with oil. Either way, if you don't want that massage, we shouldn't force you to have a massage. We don't want massage rape at all. We want people who voluntarily are willing to be massaged and people who voluntarily are willing to massage them, so that everybody is participating willingly and that everybody feels safe in that activity. The sandwich hug, getting a massage, and having sex, any kind of sex. If it's partner sex, any kind of social sex, both people should be there willingly and should have a feeling of nurturing affection for one another. Sex is not a weapon. Sex is not a way to express our anger or our power over someone else. That's a bad use of sex, because while the dominator or the angry person may be enjoying it, the other person is frightened and unwilling and is having to submit, and they're not enjoying it at all. And that is a truly unethical kind of sex. We all have our own right to have our body respected. Nobody should violate our space, our body's physical space. Nobody should touch us without our consent. But on the other hand, we should be relaxed enough to enjoy exchanging affectionate touch whenever we can. But in any case, my main point is that truly sex-positive sex, super-euphoric sex, needs to be done in a mood of emotional relaxation and calm, nurturing affection on the part of everyone who is participating, even if it's only ourselves. And we should have positive self-worth before, during, and after the sexual activity. That this is a good thing, it's a wonderful thing. We're satisfying our natural sex drive, which will make us feel emotionally happier, and we will treat other people more nicely because we've satisfied our sex drive. We're not sexually frustrated. We feel good. We're full of love for all humanity. When we've had a good orgasm, we've had a good sexual experience, a wonderful partner sex experience, a wonderful solo sex experience. It doesn't matter, as long as we have used our sex drive to create the most pleasurable states of pre-orgasmic bliss in consciousness and the most pleasurable and full consciousness orgasms we possibly can. Then we're going to feel happy, we're going to feel relaxed, we're going to feel satisfied. And if we have a positive, sex-positive image of God, even though we know God may or may not exist, but we choose to imagine that if God does exist, it makes much more sense to visualize a sex-positive God than a sex-negative God. Plus which, it's better for us emotionally. It relaxes us emotionally, and we're able to enjoy having sex much more fully if we visualize God as being sex-positive. I got to the point where I liked to imagine, enjoyed imagining God watching me. And actually I would sort of imagine God and Mrs. God watching me. In India, they had the god Shiva and his wife Parvati, and they used to have sex for 1,000 years at a time. Shiva was the original cannabis user, the original yogi, and the original tantric sex guy who could have sex for as long as you wanted. And they had temples and they still have temples in India, which in around 1200 AD were thriving temples where people came all the time. And the temples were entirely covered with erotic sculptures on the outside, demonstrating many different kinds of sexual pleasure. And Shiva and Parvati were benevolent gods and goddesses of sex. So you could imagine, so I would enjoy imagining that God was, that the more turned on I got, and the more sexual bliss I could fill my consciousness with, and the bigger my orgasms were, the more God was approving of me and saying, yes, that's what I created you for, to enjoy yourself and enjoy your consciousness and enjoy your body as much as you possibly can. Of course, put out as much enjoyment into the universe as possible. In fact, I liked to imagine that every one of us is like a little television channel that God could tune into at any time and actually experience what we're experiencing at that moment. And I think that the kind of channel that God would want to tune into, that God and Mrs. God would want to be part of and experience, would be anybody who was giving themselves super euphoric sex or sharing it with a partner and having as much sexual pleasure as possible. So that's what I would imagine when I was having solo sex for hours at a time. I was very lucky. I worked at night and I had my daytimes free and I could sleep at work at night, so I had lots of time to masturbate during the daytime. And since I had learned how to do super euphoric sex, prolonged sex, I never had any trouble filling up my time. I was never ever bored. I could have sex for as long as I wanted, and I'd be getting high, and when it's high, it's fun to imagine that God and Mrs. God are watching you and are cheering you on, saying, yes, more pleasure, because imagine that they're experiencing that pleasure through our own consciousness. And so the more pleasure we can create, the happier they are if they're experiencing it through our consciousness. And then that would mean that good things would happen to us in life if God and Mrs. God were looking down on us benevolently. So that's just a fantasy, and yet it's a fantasy that can help replace the dinosaur Christian sex negative fantasy that we were given in our sexual miseducation as we grew up. And so I wanted to continue with my own sexual miseducation and telling you about it and analyzing the effects on my emotional brain of the different sexual experiences that I had. And in order to analyze the effect that an emotional experience has on our sexual development, we need to understand just a few extremely simple and completely obvious common sense ideas about learning, how learning takes place, and what kind of learning takes place. Learning is having an experience and then storing a memory of that experience in the memory banks of your brain. There are two kinds of memories. There are scenes, actual narrative scenes that we can remember specific events that occurred. That's what we usually think of as memories. You know, we can visualize the event, we can remember what happened, and then the other kind of emotional memory, that's a very explicit memory, when we have a scene that we can associate with a particular time and place. Like when I was in the bathtub with my mom when I was 3.5 years old, that's a scenic memory. It's a vivid memory of a particular time and place. But we have simultaneously going on emotional memory, purely emotional memory. Now, every scenic memory will have emotions connected with it, and that will make that scenic memory either a pleasant one or an unpleasant one to remember. When we remember the memory, then we feel the emotion that was associated with it. So all memory has an emotional component. But in addition to scenic memories, our emotional brain has been doing emotional learning even before our brain was capable of capturing a video segment of a particular memory. That doesn't start until we're about 3 years old, or a little earlier, depending. If it's a really vivid emotional experience, those are the ones that are going to have a scenic snapshot captured in our memory banks. If it's a highly emotional experience, like when I was a little kid, some jets came over. We were at an air show, and some jets came over the stadium that we were in, and they made this huge noise, and they flew by, and it was absolutely terrifying to a 3-year-old who didn't know what was going on and what those things were. It was terrifying, and that's one of my very earliest memories, is of those jets screaming overhead over the stadium. And I could remember it because I got so scared by it. But our emotional brain learns right from birth. It starts remembering things emotionally, even if it can't put a picture to the emotion. We have certain emotional feelings that are triggered by being in a certain kind of a situation, and we may not know why we even feel the way we do. We may be made anxious by that situation, and we don't even know why. But it's because our emotional brain was made anxious in a similar situation, but we don't remember what situation it was, but our emotional brain remembers that certain situations create anxiety or scary situations. And so if we find ourselves in a similar situation, we may become anxious without even knowing why. I remember a story about a veteran from the Iraq wars who had to drive from Los Angeles out through the area of Palm Springs and down toward Indio in the desert country east of Los Angeles. And when he would drive through there, he would get really, really anxious. Every time he drove through there, he'd start to have practically a panic attack, and he wouldn't know why. But it was because it was such a similar terrain to the Middle Eastern desert where he had been deployed, and he'd had a lot of anxiety there with, roadside devices and all, and unexpected attacks at any time. So he had spent a lot of time being angry in a desert situation, even though it was on the other side of the world. And so now he's back in California where there's no real danger to him as he's driving down the freeway with the desert on both sides. But nevertheless, his emotional brain is getting anxious about it because his emotional brain learned over in the Middle East that this kind of terrain is dangerous country. So that's just an example of how the emotional brain can give us feelings without us even knowing why we're having the feelings. But all right, the principles of learning are that when we have an experience which ends up making us feel happy and giving us pleasure and euphoria in our consciousness, we'll remember that experience, and associated with the memory of that experience, we will have feelings of euphoria and pleasure, and we will desire to experience that again. And so whenever we are in a situation similar to where we experienced that pleasure before, we will have the desire to repeat the behavior that we did, which gave us that pleasure. And so that's positive learning, because the pleasure that we felt, the euphoria that we felt during that experience is what they call a reward or a reinforcer. It strengthens. A reinforcement is strengthening something. So pleasure reinforces our desire to re-experience that, to do whatever it takes to have that experience again. In the other hand, in contrast, if we have an experience that is very emotionally upsetting to us for one reason or another, makes us feel bad, and makes us feel unhappy, either pain or unhappiness, will make us not want to repeat that experience, will make us want to avoid that experience in the future. Okay, so that's the opposite of a reinforcer. That's something that is actually a repellent to doing that behavior again. It forces us to not want to do that behavior again. So those are the two principles of learning. And then we can apply this to the experiences, the sexual experiences that we have. And so the one that I've talked to you about first is when I was about 3.5 years old, and my mommy decided to start taking baths with me. And the two of us would get in the tub naked, and she would sit there, and the water came up about to her waist, so I could see her naked above the waist and see her beautiful breasts and nipples, and then I was sitting there with the water up to my chest, and it was really fun to be naked in the water with her. My emotional brain, spontaneously found that a fun situation, an erotic situation, just the way my emotional brain had found when my mommy would read me the story about water babies, and there was this little picture in the storybook of little kids about my age or younger swimming around naked in the water, underwater, and living that way. That was a turn-on to my emotional brain. My emotional brain finds being naked something sexy, and being in water and being naked even more sexy, because then the water is splashing all over your body. It feels real good. It's caressing your body. It's like a little water massage going on. And so I was enjoying those baths that I was taking with my naked mother, and I was enjoying seeing her naked and being naked with her and having a great time. And so after, a series of baths, then one day, I was feeling so good. It was making me so happy in this way that was sexual arousal, even though I didn't know that's what it was, but it was a special way of feeling good, that it gave me the urge to want to show my penis to my mother. So I lifted my penis up so that it came up above the surface of the water, to show it to her, because she was showing me her beautiful breasts. And I thought, this is fun, this is a good thing to do if we're both naked in the water, is to show each other, the sexiest parts of our body, even though I didn't know the word sexy at all. But it was my penis that I wanted to show her, especially. My emotional brain had the innate urge to exhibit my penis to this very attractive 27-year-old woman that I was naked in the tub with. And that urge to be an exhibitionist it goes way back. It's a very natural part of our human sexuality, and yet it's one of the still most repressed aspects of sexuality, for men at least. Women, have a much greater chance to be exhibitionists in daily life. But for men, exhibitionism is not allowed in public at all. And men are made to feel ashamed of their penises at a very early age, and made to feel like it's a shameful thing for anybody to see their penis naked. This is very unnatural because, of course, all of our animal ancestors, all of our chimpanzee ancestors and monkeys and so on before that, they all were naked. And when chimpanzee males are sexually aroused, they show their sexual arousal to the female that they're interested in by showing her their erect penis. And, chimpanzees live in small groups. Let's say there's a dozen or so of them in an area, and one chimpanzee, the female chimpanzee, who happens to be fertile. That only happens to a chimpanzee female once every 2 or 3 years, because she gets fertile, then she gets pregnant, and she ceases to be fertile, and while she's having the baby, and then she just takes care of the baby for a couple of years after the baby's born until it's able to go off on its own, and then she will have another period of being fertile. And the males know when a female is fertile within their group, and it's sort of a special deal when one of the females becomes fertile. It's not like they're all fertile all the time, the way human females are. But for chimpanzee females, when one of them becomes fertile, it's a big deal. And she advertises the fact. It's like she doesn't hide the fact. She can't help it. She doesn't do it intentionally. But when her hormones get into sexual receptive mode, and she's fertilizing an egg, or she's ripening an egg to be fertilized, those hormones cause her labia majora, the large lips on the outside of the vagina, to swell up. I mean, really swell up, until instead of being like that, they're like that. And they also turn day-glow pink or day-glow orange, one of the two. And the female is usually in a sort of an all-fours position with her butt sticking backwards, and so those day-glow labia majora, those day-glow vaginal lips, are flashing a message to all of the males in the group that she is fertile. And so the males will come, will be attracted to her and will come over and try and have sex with her. And females and female chimps are different in how selective they are. Some female chimps, prefer just certain guys, certain male chimps, and others will take all comers within their little group, and there may be, who knows, half a dozen guys, or maybe 12, a dozen if it's a big group, if there's 30 or more chimps. Anyway, one way that male chimps signal to the female chimps that they are interested and would like to have sex is by showing her his erect penis. And maybe she's busy eating, she's not looking around, saying, are there any erect penises in the vicinity that I need to take care of here? She may not be paying any attention to the surrounding erect penises. So this one guy will attract her attention by grabbing a branch overhead, reaching up, grabbing a branch, and doing sort of a pull-up, hanging in the air, and bounce up and down on the branch. His whole body just swinging in the air, bouncing up and down. And of course, his erect penis is going to be bouncing up and down too, and the noise of the leaves and the movement will attract her attention, and she'll look over there, and she'll see, oh, there's an erect penis that I could have fun with if I am willing to let him come on over. And so then she, tells him come on over, or she ignores him and says, no thanks, I've had enough sex today. I'm not interested in any more. Leave me alone. But for the male, exhibiting his erect penis is a natural way of demonstrating the fact that he's sexually aroused to whatever female he is fertile and that he's interested in at that time. So the fact that human beings suppress, at least that our culture certainly suppresses the erect male penis, it's probably the most forbidden sexual symbol in our society. It's the one that is hidden more than any other sexual symbol. You can see a woman's body, and you can see in the movies, limp penises a lot sometimes. But an erect penis you only see in porn. Okay, it's definitely off limits for other semi-erotic or soft porn stimulation and movies. So this was not the case. The erect penis was not hidden back at the time of the Greeks and Romans. The Greeks used to have statues of the god Mercury, whose Greek name was Hermes, so they were called Hermes statues. And oftentimes it would just be a square column with the face of Mercury or Hermes at the top of the column, and then a square column, and then an erect penis sticking out of the middle of it. Other times you would have a full sculpture of the god Hermes with the erect penis sticking out of the middle of it. But it was the erect penis that was the important part of the sculpture. And this wasn't for erotic stimulation. This was for good luck. They believed that an erect penis had magical protective properties. And people, women particularly, would wear amulets around their neck of an erect penis hanging from a little necklace in order to protect them. It was a magical symbol. And so there were these Hermes statues at every major crossroads. In the city of Athens, for instance, every house would have a Hermes statue with an erect penis at the doorway to the house. So it's not like any women grew up in that culture without knowing what an erect penis looked like. It was a very common and familiar sight in the Greco-Roman world. They saw the erect penis as a positive thing, as a good thing, But that's not the case in our culture. Anyway, so when I showed my penis to my mom in the bathtub, it probably was erect. I wasn't thinking about whether it was erect or not, but my whole body had a kind of glow of sexual arousal happening. So it's likely that my little penis was erect when I lifted up the middle of my body and showed my penis to my mommy. And that was the moment when my exhibitionistic behavior could have been rewarded and reinforced, but it wasn't, because it took my mommy by surprise, and it scared her that taking a bath with me had suddenly become a sexual thing. She didn't really want that to become, she may have been being turned on by it herself, but she didn't want it to become a sexual interaction between us, and it startled her when I showed her my penis voluntarily like that, and that I was turned on. It startled her, and I could see that on the expression of her face. And so the whole emotional ambiance of the situation had changed from happy, relaxed, nurturing, playful, good times to all of a sudden a chill of anxiety in the air. And we got out of the bath pretty soon after that, and Mommy never suggested that I take a bath with her again ever. That was the end of the mutual baths, unfortunately. So that was not a reinforcement of my exhibitionistic behavior. It taught me just the opposite, that, oh, socially there's something wrong with showing my penis to somebody else. So I shouldn't do that in the future. You know, it was one trial learning. I'm pretty quick to learn things. And so it only took one experience for me to learn, oh, well, if you're naked in the bath with your mama, you don't show her your penis. And so you probably shouldn't do it with anybody else either. And then it means the end of bath time with mommy forever. So that's like the removal of a pleasure. And that's the opposite of a reward. It's like taking a reward away. So that behavior was punished by losing an enjoyable, pleasurable experience that I had been having. So it wasn't a terribly traumatic form of learning. I wasn't spanked or told that I was a bad boy or anything, but silently there was the message there that this behavior should not be repeated. So that was my first sexual experience, and it did not end in reinforcing the behavior. But until I did that, I'd been having a really fun time with mommy in the bathtub, and I had been getting turned on by it. And so I did have positive memories of sexual enjoyment, of being in the water naked with a beautiful woman. And so I did have those positive memories to store up in my memory bank. My emotional brain would always remember that and would always find being in the water with a woman naked a sexy thing to do. So there was positive learning that occurred there. But then as far as the actual responding by exhibitionism, that was, not reinforced, that was weakened. That response was weakened rather than encouraged. It was discouraged, even though it was just done silently without any words. Okay, so after that, let's move on through my sexual arousal history. The next sexy memory that I have was a few months after that. My mother and I had flown down to South America and joined my father and his preaching partner, the two of them were conducting a series of evangelical preaching missions in Brazil. And my father's preaching partner's family was also down there. And as members of the family, there were myself and their son David, who was a year older than me, and then David's older sister, Astrid, who was 16. And so in the afternoons in Rio de Janeiro, there was a hotel and a nice sunny room upstairs, and a nice little place to be. And our parents the four of them were going out and sightseeing Rio. I don't know where they were going, but they were going to do something that we kids weren't invited to. So David and I stayed home, and Astrid, the 16-year-old, babysat us. And I really didn't know her from before. But here she was, this beautiful, blonde girl of about 16, similar kind of Northern European good looks that my mom had, and I felt a glow of erotic attraction to Astrid, the babysitter, that afternoon, and I still remember that. Okay, it was vivid enough for me to remember this. This was another occasion of being really attracted to a woman. After that, about a year or so later, maybe a couple of years later, I must have been about 5, I think, and 4 or 5 probably. And our family went with my father's cousin and his family on a cruise up to Alaska on one of those cruise ships. And on that trip, there was my cousin, she was actually my second cousin, Diane. And I was 5 and she was 6, something like that, or I was 4 and she was 5, something like that, quite young, but nevertheless close enough in age. And I developed a real crush on Diane. She was a cute little brunette, and we hung out, during that whole voyage. When we were on the ship, we would hang out together, all day and have fun together. And I really had these same kind of budding love feelings for her. It's like I had a crush on her at that age. And we never did anything about it. I never said anything about it. I didn't try to see her with her clothes off or anything like that. We just hung out a lot, and I had those feelings for her. But then, about 50 years later, when we're fully grown, I'm in my, mid-40s, I guess, I don't know, maybe 40 years later. I'm in my mid-40s, she must have been then about 46. And we're at a family gathering where her mother is there, my mother is there, my girlfriend is there, Diane is there, and her husband is there. And at some point during the day, Diane mentions that Steve was the first boy I ever kissed. And she had a memory of having kissed me on that trip. So I don't have that memory. I think that that's something she either dreamed or imagined, and it was a manufactured memory, because I'm sure I would have remembered it if it had happened. I wouldn't have forgotten something like that, my first kiss. But anyway, that shows me that it was a mutual feeling, that she had the same feelings that I did, even though neither of us talked about it. And we never, touched each other in an affectionate way like that. She never kissed me, or I never kissed her. But she thought that, she remembered that later. Now, you might say, well, then Steve, if she could invent that memory, what about you and your mom in the bathtub? Maybe you invented that memory, and it's such a vivid memory I had, and I remember, multiple baths. And the reason that I know it's not a memory that I made up is because if I had made up that memory, when I showed her my penis, she would have been happy instead of shocked by it and surprised by it. So the outcome would not have been something that I would have imagined. That the outcome makes it very clear that not only because it's a very vivid memory to me that it actually happened, but also that the scenario, the plot line of the story was not a plot line that I would have wanted to have happen. It was just the opposite. So, but anyway, what we can learn from these three experiences so far, my mom in the bathtub, Astrid, the babysitter in Rio, and Diane, my cousin, on the boat, is that certainly my emotional brain was attracted to women from a very early age. And people can always tell who it is that they're attracted to from about the age of childhood sexuality, and childhood interest onward. And so many gay people will remember, say, I knew that I was attracted to people of my own sex from childhood onward, from a very early age, if they had the opportunity to interact with someone at that age in a sexy way. So moving on, Diane, then we get to the incident I told you about where our family was visiting another family friend group, and one of their daughters and I were sleeping in the same bedroom all by ourselves. My bed was here, her bed was over there, and her sister usually slept in the bed I was sleeping in, but now she was being moved to a different room because there were a lot of extra people staying in the house. And our parents were out in the living room talking together. Lights were out, and Kathy and I started talking in whispers back and forth, and somebody got the idea, wouldn't it be fun if we took off our pajamas? And, oh yeah, that would be fun. So I went over to her bed, and I was ready to take off my pajamas, and I just should have gone ahead and done it. But I didn't want to seem selfish, and I didn't want to seem egocentric, and so I wanted to give her the opportunity to take off her pajamas first. I said, you go first. She said, no, you go first. No, you go first. We were both being over polite. We should have just, both of us done exactly what we wanted, got rid of our pajamas immediately, and explored, to see what each other's body looked like, because, we didn't have a good idea of what, someone of the opposite sex looked like. She had a little sister. I had a little brother, so we didn't have a sibling whose body we could check out and see what the differences were. So I had no idea, what a woman's or girl's body looked like below the waist. And it would have been a fun opportunity to find out. But just as we were discussing who was going to go first, we hear the clump, 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 clump of footsteps coming down the hall toward the bedroom. And, we knew immediately that we already knew we were doing something we shouldn't be doing, because ordinarily nobody takes their clothes off together. And so I quickly scampered back to my bed and got under the covers, and she got under the covers in her bed, and we both pretended to be sound asleep, and her mother came and, checked and tucked us both in, and kept an eye on us. And so, they must have heard us in the next room. They must have heard us talking to each other or something, and wondered what we were getting up to, and decided to interrupt it. And so, that was it. There was no more suggestion of trying to do that again, because we've been scared. We've been almost caught at doing something we shouldn't be doing. And so, once again, there wasn't much of a pleasurable experience. It was fun. It was sexy. It felt sexy just talking to her about taking our clothes off. Having that conversation was sexually arousing, in an emotional way. I don't think I got physically aroused yet, but I was, emotionally, my sexual arousal circuits and sexual interest circuits were certainly firing in my emotional brain, and so were hers. So we had some, positive beginnings of an experience there, but then we had anxiety and, an end to the situation, which was basically, instead of reinforcement, obviously it was punishment. There was no way that her mother coming in and doing that was going to strengthen our ability or our desire to have that experience again. Well, I still had the desire, I guess, but it had been frustrated. And so that kind of was like the story of my life, was getting in a situation where my desire was aroused, but then something would happen and would frustrate my desire before it could be fully satisfied. That was the same thing that happened with a few years later. See, that would have been when Kathy maybe was 7 and I was 6, let's say. And then a few years later, when I was down in New Zealand, and I was fooling around with my little playmate was the daughter of the woman who ran this boarding house for retired missionaries. She was 5 and I was 8, so it was a little bit of cradle robbing there. And in this case, for some reason, I wasn't intent on being an exhibitionist, but I wanted to play doctor with her. I wanted, and I got her on the bed. She was willing to get on the bed, and pull up her skirt. And I was just about to pull down her panties. And she was perfectly willing, just like Kathy had been perfectly willing. But then, just right then, her mother, opens the door and catches us and is shocked by what she sees. And she didn't get angry. She didn't actually punish us. But she just said, this is a game we don't play. We don't play this kind of a game. And that was the end of it. And, I've always been too law-abiding a person, too, rule-behaving a person, particularly when I was younger. And so if I was told, something shouldn't be done, well, I didn't do it. So once again, instead of being rewarded for my sexual explorations, they were interrupted and frustrated, and I was, made to feel that it was wrong to do that. I was getting sexual miseducation that is wrong for children to explore each other sexually. Now, it turns out that in many, many species, they all go through a period of juvenile or childhood sexual exploration between the immature young, males and females, explore each other. This happens in mammals, it happens in ducks and birds and so forth. It's an important preparation for adult sexuality, is this period of childhood sexual play. And so if our goal is to have children grow up with a good, strong, healthy, guilt-free sexual response system built into their emotional brain, then we should be allowing them to engage in this sexual play. We should allow them to be self-determining, as Wilhelm Reich would say. He said, let children determine for themselves what it is they want to do sexually, and the adults should just stay out of it. It would not take any reinforcement on the part of the adults to encourage to develop a strong sexual response if the children were allowed to play together sexually, because sexual activity of this sort and most sorts, sexual activity is a self-rewarding activity. As long as it's not interfered with, it is its own reward. So if children are allowed to play together sexually, their sexual arousal is a euphoric feeling that makes that activity rewarding, and therefore activity that they will want to repeat in the future. And if they are just simply not interfered with by adults, then they will learn to be turned on by their sexual interactions with other children, and they will learn to have a strong sexual arousal response. So anyway, that's plenty for today, but I'll pick it up here again next time. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll continue on with my next sexual adventures, which are going to start to be pretty darn interesting.